Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first of the public lectures for the magnificent exhibition upstairs at Tudors to Windsors, British Royal Portraits from Holbein to Warhol. This is an extraordinary collaboration between our museum here in Houston and the National Portrait Gallery in London. And they have allowed some of their greatest treasures to come here to Texas, some of which have never traveled outside Great Britain before. And we are enormously pleased and grateful to them for this, allowing this great exhibition to take place. We're absolutely thrilled that to be able to mount this exhibition. For this lecture, it was originally advertised as being given by Louise Stuart, who is one of the curators at the National Portrait Gallery. And she is unable to come, but we are delighted and very pleased that an equally distinguished curator from the National Portrait Gallery, Charlotte Bolland, is here with us today and will deliver the lecture. And Charlotte is Senior Curator of Research and 16th Century Collections at the National Portrait Gallery in London. And she has responsibility for the acquisition, research and interpretation of portraits dating from the 16th century. So she is the great expert on the Tudors, and it's been especially wonderful for I and my fellow curators here to talk to her about the Tudor portraits in the exhibition upstairs. She joined the National Portrait Gallery in 2011 as the project curator for an extraordinary project called Making Art in Tudor Britain, which was investigating the techniques and the context of Tudor art in Great Britain. And it followed a doctoral project that she carried out into material culture at the Tudor court with the University of London and the Royal Collection in Great Britain. She co-curated a number of exhibitions at the National Portrait Gallery, including a very significant one called The Real Tudors, Kings and Queens Rediscovered in 2014. And that was accompanied by a great catalogue, a great book, which you should try and look at when you can. And also, more recently, the Encounter drawings from Leonardo to Rembrandt, which was another great significant exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery. Her lecture today, as you see, is Royal Portraits at the National in the National Portrait Gallery collection, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce her, Charlotte Bolland. Please welcome her.
Thank you very much for coming this afternoon. The Tudors to Windsors is the National Portrait Gallery's flagship international touring exhibition, and it draws on the gallery's outstanding collection of portraits of kings and queens, their families and favourites. And we're delighted that the first venue is the Museum of Fine Arts, where, as I'm sure you will agree, or when you go and see it later on, the works are shown to stunning effect in the museum's beautiful gallery spaces, which guide you through 500 years of British history. And one of the key themes of the exhibition is the way in which royal portraiture has been used not only to reflect, but also to cement and even to create royal power. And today, I'd like to focus on the theme, taking you on a tour of the royal portraits in our collections, from some of the finest ever made to surprising conservation discoveries and unexpected insights into royal family life. And throughout, I'll be thinking about what these portraits were meant to convey, what they were meant to achieve for the royals they depicted, and what makes a successful royal portrait. And the vast majority of the works I'll be talking about today are included in the exhibition, so you need only go upstairs to go and see them in the flesh. But first, the National Portrait Gallery. It was founded in 1856 with the aim of creating a collection of portraits of the men and women who have made and are making a significant contribution to British history and culture. And today we have over 193,000 objects in our collections, making it the largest collection of British portraits in the world. And these include paintings, sculptures, works on paper and photographs, as well as more unexpected media, such as wax, ceramic figurines, death masks and video portraits. And from the outset, royal portraits have played a very significant part in our collections. For the first 100 years of the gallery's existence, the reigning monarch was the only living sitter on display. everyone else had to have been dead for 20 years before they could qualify. And today, visitors to the collection can see images of every monarch from Henry VII, who came to the throne in 1485, to our present Queen, Elizabeth II. And these royal portraits provide the chronological spine to the displays, telling the story of British history. And as works commissioned from the leading artists of the day by the most powerful patrons, the story of portraiture in Britain as well. The gallery's chronology begins in 1485, with the accession of Henry VII and the end of the English civil wars known as the Wars of the Roses, and now perhaps more familiar as the source material for a large part of Game of Thrones. That Henry was the last Lancastrian claimant to the English throne and defeated the Yorkist Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field, a moment that's often seen as a turning point in English history, from the medieval to the early modern period. And this is perhaps encapsulated in Henry VII's funeral effigy and tomb in Westminster Abbey. Funeral effigies were intended to be lifelike. They were dressed in the king's clothes and performed a ceremonial function. And Henry VII's is an extraordinary survival, and perhaps the finest. It was made for this medieval tradition, but by an Italian Renaissance artist, Pietro Torrigiani, who created the king's likeness from a death mask. So perhaps of all the royal portraits, this is the closest we are going to come to the Tudors in the flesh. The Italian then used this likeness in the creation of Henry VII's tomb in Westminster Abbey, where he is buried alongside his queen, Elizabeth of York. And she was the daughter of the opposing side in the Wars of the Roses, who he had married in order to secure his rule. Elizabeth died a few years before Henry and before Torrigiani arrived in England, and her likeness in the tomb is perhaps more generic. And the difference in style between the effigy head and the tomb portrait reminds us of the key consideration that we should bear in mind when looking at portraits, and particularly royal ones. What is the purpose of the image, and who is the intended audience? The funeral effigy presents a careworn man, the individual who had died. By contrast, the tomb presents an image of timeless magnificence. The monarchy is an everlasting institution. Now, of course, the difficulty in understanding tomb sculpture in the context of portraiture is that the works are all in place in cathedrals and churches, and are often inaccessible in chapels and behind grilles. And the Portrait Gallery recognised this in its earliest stages, and amongst the earliest works in the collection are a group of electrotype copies of the portrait sculptures from the royal tomb monuments, including the portrait of Henry VII, which you can see here in the exhibition. And these electrotype copies, in a wonderful kind of combination of Victorian scientific innovation and Tudor medieval sculpture, really allows you to kind of get so close to the image of Henry VII in a way that you can't see with the tomb in Westminster Abbey. The earliest painted portraits that you will see in the exhibition are the paired images of Henry VII's son, and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Independent paintings in oil paint on wooden panels only really began to be made in England in the early 16th century, often by artists who had emigrated from the Netherlands. They were small-scale works of art and made for an extremely elite audience, often as part of marriage negotiations. And these images in particular have assumed a kind of retrospective poignancy because, as we all know, perhaps the most memorable fact about Henry VIII is that he had 6 wives. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. I'm not going to talk about all the wives today, but you can see in the exhibition, but instead to focus on the images. That Catherine of Aragon, here on the right, is the sort of locus of the kind of the key Tudor disruption in relation to the break from the church in Rome, because she had arrived in England to marry Henry VIII's older brother, Arthur. And as is the case you will see in so many of the royal narratives that unfold throughout the exhibition, things never go to plan. So Prince Arthur, the heir to the throne, predeceases his father. And Catherine, who had arrived in great pomp as the daughter of the Catholic kings of Spain, so one of the most powerful monarchies in the world, is suddenly left marooned in England in this kind of limbo state. And Henry, in a sort of chivalric act, perhaps encapsulating this moment when he was projecting himself as the ideal Renaissance prince that he was handsome, good-looking, ran the jousts, was sporting, educated, loved music. And so he decided that his first act on becoming king at the death of his father would be to marry his brother's widow. So he married Catherine of Aragon, and then they were married very happily for many years. Unfortunately, none of their male children survived. They had one daughter, Mary, who survived. One son, Henry, died after only a few weeks, and then there was a terrible succession of miscarriages. And so Henry began to see this, his marriage as some kind of indictment from God, that he was being punished for having married his brother's widow. And so began to look for biblical precedents to be able to actually annul his marriage. And so he sought justification to divorce Catherine of Aragon, and this was undertaken. She, however, never sort of accepted this decision. And so while she was, after the divorce, styled the Dowager Princess as the widow of Prince Arthur, she always referred to herself as Queen. And she kept within her possession paired portraits of herself and Henry VIII, even when she'd been sort of exiled out to kind of drafty and, windy castles. But to kind of guide your eyes around the significance of these portraits, that the kind of how can we tell who the people are, that the cloth of gold that they're wearing, cloth of gold was restricted to the highest levels of the royal family by statute, so incredibly expensive clothes that they're wearing. We have here that the kind of first Tudor rose you'll see in the exhibition up here in the top left of the spandrel, because Henry VII was from the Red Rose of Lancaster, Elizabeth of York from the White Rose of York, and in their coming together, their child, both roses now came together in the form of the red and white Tudor rose and Henry VIII. And another, Henry is here putting a ring on his finger in the kind of gesture of taking on power. And also as a thing that you might notice, all these black jewels in the lavish collar that Henry wears. And these are actually diamonds. That the fashion in the 16th century was that diamonds were prized for their luster, not for their brilliance. They wasn't having the kind of multifaceted cut. And so they were often lined with black foil at the back to really enhance their luster. So when you see these kind of enormous blobs of black, it's not that anything is tarnished or chained. It was that they were deliberately made that way. But what's also intriguing about this portrait and why I wanted to focus on it, is the problem of mistaken identity, which many early portraits suffer from. And you would think that if you are the wife of the king and married him for 20 years, that your image would be well known, that you wouldn't have to worry about your legacy. But she spent a lot of time identified as a portrait of Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's sixth wife. And it was only during a research project, the Making Art in Tudor Britain project, that colleagues visiting Lambeth Palace in London to see another portrait noted this sort of high on a wall, rather discreetly hanging, and sort of said, "Oh, could we take a little bit of a closer look at that one, please?" And we're thinking that actually the clothes that she's wearing are very much of a fashion from the 1520s, not the 1540s, which would be Catherine Parr's moment. And very excitingly, it looks to be retaining its original frame, that nearly all 16th century frames have been lost. But this had its original frame, an engaged frame, which is built around the painting. And so we were able to bring it to the gallery to have a conservation treatment, that the whole back had been covered in a very sort of thick and goopy black paint, so we were able to remove and reveal the sort of damask green behind, and elements of the original decorative scheme. So these tiny little red fragments here are why we then decided to have the very vibrant red on the frame, but we've left those visible so that you can see as a kind of slightly archaeological trace of the portrait. So today, Henry VIII, as I said, is remembered as a sort of dashing Renaissance prince, but also as a despot, that he murdered 2 wives, numerous nobles and close advisors. And he's also this kind of embodiment of a sort of an idea of merry England. And whichever view of Henry you subscribe to, what is clear is that his image endures. And this is largely down to one man, Hans Holbein the Younger. Holbein, a German artist, began to work for Henry VIII in the early 1530s. And in 1537, he completed several portraits, including at least 2 of the king. And one of these was a mural painted on a wall in one of the king's private chambers at Whitehall Palace. It was lost in a fire in the 17th century, But today, Holbein's original preparatory drawing is in the gallery's collection. And it's one of the complete jewels of the collection, but is too fragile to travel. In part because the design is peppered with small pinprick holes, which allowed for the transfer of the design to another piece of paper, large consolidated sheet of paper, that would then have been pounced, a technique where you put charcoal through it to transfer the design to the wall. But Holbein evidently recognised that his drawing of the king would be useful and that he didn't want to perhaps destroy it in making one work, but to repurpose it to make many works in the future. The wall mural is known from a 17th century copy shown here, and it really celebrates the sort of dynastic ambitions of the Tudors. So you have Henry VII and Elizabeth of York at the back, and then Henry VIII and his third wife, Jane Seymour. That Jane, the exact timings of the murals aren't known, but it's likely that Jane Seymour had probably already given birth to the dreamed, hoped-for son, Prince Edward. And so it's a real celebration of the enduring continuity of the Tudor dynasty. But if you look closely at the drawing and the copy, you'll see that the angle of the king's face has changed from a three-quarter portrait to a much more confrontational face-on image. And the final wall painting was said to terrify those who saw it. And it's tempting to think that the change in the composition reflects the wishes of the king himself. That in the preparatory drawing, that this is actually a sort of cut-out sheet that Holbein could then sort of change to adjust the image of the king he wanted. And in this exhibition, not quite yet, but imminently, you will be able to compare Holbein's two perspectives of the king, with a small portrait on copper in the centre from the gallery's collection, which is a copy of Holbein's portrait in the Thyssen collection in Madrid on the left, and a three-quarter length portrait from the Barberini collection in Rome, which is on its way to this exhibition in a couple of weeks. And this may have been produced in the context of Henry's third marriage to Anne of Cleves. And this frontal image of Henry conveys his powerful presence through his direct gaze, and in the full-length versions, the wide-legged stance. And this became the definitive image of the king, and in subsequent centuries, a sort of visual shorthand for autocratic royal power more generally. Henry VIII had 3 children, and the best known is probably Elizabeth I, Henry's daughter by his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Variously known as Gloriana, the Fairy Queen, Good Queen Bess, and England's Virgin Queen, one of the reasons that Elizabeth is so well remembered is her incredibly powerful portraiture. And one of the most important surviving portraits is included in the exhibition here. That I'm obviously biased as a 16th century collections curator at the gallery, but this is the one I feel I'll be writing the most emails to our visitors about, saying it's in Texas. So it was commissioned by the prominent courtier Sir Henry Lee, and it was intended for display during an entertainment he hosted for the Queen at his estate at Ditchley in Oxfordshire. And as such, Elizabeth would have seen this portrait. So when you are standing there, remember that you are, in essence, standing in the footsteps of Elizabeth herself in looking at this image. We don't, of course, because no one ever writes down anything useful, have a record of her opinion of the performance and the moment. But Henry Lee certainly hoped that she would like it. That the whole entertainment, was, of which the portrait formed part, was intended to regain the Queen's favour, following his decision to live with his mistress without her permission. That Elizabeth famously never married, but nonetheless retained a rigid control over everybody else's relationships at court. And so, as such, this is a flattering likeness which presents Elizabeth as all-powerful, indeed almost supernatural. Painted in 1592, it shows the Queen in her early 60s. She stands on a map of England, symbolising both her ownership and control of the land, but also her mystical marriage to the realm of England, which Elizabeth used as a rhetorical device to justify her decision not to marry. The Queen's feet, the tiny feet pointing out of here, are planted firmly on Oxfordshire, which where Lee's entertainment took place at Ditchley. The Queen is also in control of the elements. She turns away from the stormy skies while the clouds part for the sun, probably as a symbol of her forgiveness of Lee. And the portrait, in many ways, is a sort of visual encapsulation of the English literary Renaissance, the world that produced Shakespeare, Johnson, and Spenser, and demonstrates how the English had adopted and then transformed the possibilities of portraiture over the course of the 16th century. And like Holbein's image of Henry VIII, This portrait of Elizabeth has echoed down the centuries, being constantly copied and reused. And so here you can see her in a 19th century satirical cartoon with Queen Victoria, a 1930s cigarette cup, a Royal Dalton cup celebrating the coronation of Elizabeth II, and this is Louise Stuart's personal favourite, Elizabeth I's Barbie, in which the costume has been meticulously reproduced. I'm very proud to say that this is now in the Portrait Gallery's collection. That although the Ditchley portrait has become the definitive image of Elizabeth, there was huge demand for portraits of the Queen during her lifetime, and a wide range of images of varying quality were produced. And a number of these survive in the gallery's collection and were analysed as part of the Making Art in Tudor Britain project. And one particularly interesting image, which is not in the exhibition, but I wanted to highlight in order to sort of raise the question about the object history of portraits and the changes that are made in their creation. So this image of Elizabeth I, when it was x-rayed with the image on the left, it became clear that it was painted over an unfinished portrait of another woman. So there's an eye, a nose, mouth, and just got a sort of bit of a hood going off over that way. Even more intriguing, so that's a sort of layer one that's happening in the paints, and then that sort of has been abandoned, and they've started again with Elizabeth. Then, while painting the portrait of Elizabeth, this has happened in her hands. And what this is the Queen holding a snake, perhaps in an association with wisdom. But this design was abandoned, probably because the snake had other negative associations with the figure of Eve and original sin. And it was painted over so that it now holds a much less controversial bunch of flowers. That due to the kind of changing, the sort of increasing transparency of the paint layers over time, you now have the slightly disconcerting thing of sort of half a snake showing through the layer of the portrait. So Elizabeth died in 1603. And as she had refused to marry, in spite of pressure from her advisors, she did not leave a direct heir. And so the crown passed to her cousin, James VI of Scotland, who would reign as James I of England. And James's accession to the throne was greeted with great optimism by the English people, because after years of uncertainty and anxiety about the succession as a result of Elizabeth's childlessness, here was a king who, with his Queen Anne of Denmark, had already produced 2 sons. There was an heir and a spare ready to go, and also a daughter, who was an important pawn in the game of international dynastic marriage negotiations. And crucially, while he was the son of the Catholic Mary Queen of Scots, he had been raised a Protestant. So this is the other recurring theme of the exhibition, that things never go to plan, but if you're Catholic, you have no chance of getting the throne after the Reformation, that everything will be stacked against you completely. And that although formally not united, James developed the idea of the Kingdom of Great Britain, including the prototypes of the Union Jack flag that contain both the English cross of St. George and the Scottish cross of St. Andrew. And here he wears the incredibly lavish hat jewel called the Feather of Great Britain. So as I said, these are all diamonds. You can see a scale of the, lavish jewellery. That very unfortunately, almost no jewellery survives from the 16th or 17th century, because jewels can be adapted to fashion. They're very easily turned into currency. So they're the kind of first things to get broken down. And so, yes, almost none of them survive. We just have the inventories and images in portraits. But the key role of James's children in highlighting the stability of the new Stuart dynasty meant that many of their portraits were produced. And 2 of the most outstanding are included in the exhibition here, both by Robert Peake the Elder, who alongside Marcus Garrett, who painted the Ditchley portrait, was one of the most important artists working in early 17th century England. So we have here also Charles, who's not in the exhibition in this form, but in another, as you'll see in a moment. The portrait of the Princess Elizabeth, who is named after her godmother, Elizabeth I, was painted around 1610 when she was 14 years old, and was probably intended to advertise her as a potential bride to European princes. The face is particularly finely painted, emphasising her beauty, with extreme attention paid to her rich clothing and jewels. And in relation to the many divergences of the royal succession in Britain, Elizabeth, who became known as the Winter Queen after her marriage to Count Frederick of the Palatinate, who accepted the crown of Bohemia, and this is the Czech Republic, but was deposed after only a year. So she acquired this title of the Winter Queen and became very much a kind of romantic Protestant heroine who is acclaimed in an echo that will resonate with all of you as the Queen of Hearts in the early 17th century. And it was a century later, the Hanoverian George I, who traces his right to the throne through his grandmother Sophia, who was Elizabeth's youngest daughter. So it's a complete tangent of the family tree, but she is the one who brings it sort of back. That Henry, Prince of Wales, was again, another ideal Renaissance prince, an important patron of the arts, and he engaged Robert Peke as his painter long before the artist came to the attention of his father. Here he is as this wonderfully elegant figure, surrounded by a number of kind of keys to his identity and important elements to him. So you have the landscape viewed in the background. It seems to be of a kind of Italianate style, reminiscent of the galleries, of the gardens he created at the Palace of Richmond, showcasing his sort of taste and ability to tame nature. His amazingly plumed hat bears his initials, and also another, incredible jewel. And he wears the Lesser George and the Garter, indicating that he's a member of the Order of the Garter, which is the highest order of chivalry in Britain, founded by Edward III in the 14th century and still in existence today. The order consists of only 24 knights and includes the sovereign and the Prince of Wales, and each member is personally appointed by the King or Queen, so membership is an important sign of royal favour, or, as is the case here, the position of the Prince of Wales as the heir to the throne. That the Lesser George is a small pendant depicting St. George, England's patron saint, in the moment of killing the dragon, and the Garter bears the motto of the order, which, translated from the French, means "shame be on him who thinks evil on it." Unfortunately, Robert Peke seems to have trouble with the spelling of pense and how to do an S, but yes, it's sort of it's gone a little bit wrong there. Yes, will come as no surprise by now that Henry died before he could assume the throne, just after 2 years after this portrait was made, dashing the hopes of his many followers and clearing the way for his brother Charles to inherit the throne as Charles I. And here we see a really wonderfully intimate image of Charles. And unlike other images of kings and queens in formal robes surrounded by attributes of their power, this sort of is a really dynamic portrait with a sense of movement and immediacy. And it seems to give us a glimpse of Charles the man, as his family and most intimate royal favourites must have known him. But in 1649, in the midst of a bloody civil war, Charles was executed by Parliament, an unprecedented event which gave rise to incredible representations in visual culture. And one to share with you here, this is going to become a bit gory, apologies, is a miniature set with micas, which hasn't been able to come to the exhibition. But this was an image which you could, you started off with your core portrait miniature of Charles on copper, and then you would overlay the narrative over the top. So here we have him in jail, he's imprisoned during trial. Then we have continuing to wear his hat as a sign that he didn't recognise the court. Here we have accompanying the Bishop of London, who led the prayers on the morning of his execution, walking to his execution, accompanied by a figure carrying his death warrant and supporters, and then the execution and apotheosis. And we think that miniatures like this were made during the Commonwealth period after Charles's execution, but before the restoration of the monarchy. And they may have expressed opposition to the parliamentary government then in power. As such, they would have been dangerous objects to own. And it's significant that the small scale of these and other royalist objects meant that they could easily be concealed within the home or the person. And with their changeable overlays, the miniatures encourage the viewer to actively engage with the story of Charles' trial, execution, and apotheosis. And after Charles's execution, Britain was ruled as a republic, but for only just over 10 years. For much of this time, the parliamentary soldier Oliver Cromwell held the position of Lord Protector, or head of state. And after Cromwell's death in 1658, that Charles I's son, also called Charles, who'd been living in exile in Europe, was invited to return and claim the throne. He was crowned Charles II in 1660 to much public rejoicing. So today, Charles's court is remembered for its decadence. The Republican government, influenced by Puritanism, had banned theatre and gambling and suppressed holidays like Christmas and Easter. And the atmosphere after the restoration of the monarchy is sometimes seen as a reaction to the years of cultural austerity. The theatre returned with a vengeance, and for the first time, women appeared on stage. Charles II had a number of mistresses and fathered 14 acknowledged illegitimate children. Some of his mistresses wielded significant political power due to their influence over the king, and painters, above all Sir Peter Lely, deployed new styles to depict both the sumptuousness and the licentiousness of court life. And this is exemplified in Lely's portrait of Barbara Villiers, the Duchess of Cleveland, which is just wonderful. So Villiers was the most important of Charles's mistresses in the early part of his reign. And the portrait sums up the excesses of the Restoration Court in that it presents Villiers and her illegitimate son by the king as the Virgin and Child. That Horace Walpole noted in the 18th century that a version of this portrait hung as the altarpiece in a convent in France until the identity of the sitter was discovered, when it was swiftly removed. So the portrait was offered to the gallery in 2004, and being of a famous sitter by a very important artist was of clear interest to the collection. But just in that other question about kind of object histories, that curators began the process of carrying out research into the provenance. And this entails research in archives and inventories, and the research showed that the work had actually had suspect provenance in the key period between 1933 and 1945. That there was a description of a portrait of Barbara Villiers by Sir Peter Lely, which had been stolen from a palace in Hungary by the Nazis during the Second World War. Part of a collection of the Hanoverian family of bankers, it was taken to Germany in 1944 and never recovered. But of course, the gallery would never consider acquiring a stolen work, and so further research was needed to check whether the portrait in the description was the same as the one now offered to the gallery, or another one. And in this, the curator of 17th century portraits felt quite confident that actually this work would not be the same as the one in Hungary, because as often happens with works, that the kind of fame of Charles II's court, that means that there are a number of sort of optimistic identifications of Barbara Villiers' portraits around the place. And also, as Sir Peter Lely produced many hundreds of portraits, but is the main sort of name from that period, a number of optimistic attributions to Peter Lely. So the curator felt that a written description of Barbara Villiers by Peter Lely, it didn't necessarily mean that it would be this portrait. And indeed, it was the image that was described as such was very, very different. And so we were able to inquire it for the collection. But if anybody has seen this portrait, people want to know where it is. The Stuart monarchs continued to rule Britain until 1714, when Queen Anne died without an heir. That under British law at the time, the British monarch could not be a Catholic. And so the throne was offered to Anne's closest living Protestant relative, George, Elector of the German Principality of Hanover, who ruled Britain as George I. And this was the beginning of the Georgian period, which would be remembered for developments in science and industry, the emergence of the British Empire, and the flowering of art and architecture. But George himself was a complete unknown entity in Britain, and so work had to quickly be done to make his image more widely known. And so this portrait is related to the preparation for a new coin by the Royal Mint, hence its profile format. And the king's armour was intended to show his determination to defend the Protestant faith and his new realm. And possibly the most interesting of the Hanoverian monarchs was George III. His long reign, which lasts from 1760 until 1820, saw a real surge in the popularity of the monarchy. Although, of course, George famously suffered from ill health and was also the king who lost Britain's American colonies. That George and his wife Charlotte are represented in the exhibition in two of the most glamorous portraits in the National Portrait Gallery's collections, made by the Scottish artist Alan Ramsay to celebrate the coronation, which took place on the 22nd of September 1761. And the pair wear the coronation robes, which are trimmed and lined with ermine. That George's outfit is augmented with the insignia of the Order of the Garter, while Charlotte's bodice is encrusted with jewels as she reaches out towards a crown and sceptre, symbols of royal authority. And numerous versions of these portraits were made, and many found their way into Britain's overseas colonies, where they represented the authority of the British Empire. And it's likely that some of these paintings were destroyed as countries gained their independence. At the time of their production, they represented the royal couple as elegant and majestic, and we know that George himself approved, because 4 pairs of Ramsay's portraits are recorded as hanging at various royal palaces during his lifetime. And they present a marked contrast to later images of the king, which document the bouts of mental illness that he suffered from the 1780s. And this image was intended to elicit sympathy for the incapacitated king and urged his subjects not to forget him. And there are various theories about what might have caused George's illness. It may have been the hereditary condition porphyria. That a lock of George's hair in the collections of the Science Museum in London was analysed recently to see whether it could shed any light on the matter. And it was found to contain arsenic at a concentration over 30 times that is considered to be toxic. Arsenic was an ingredient in some of the supposedly therapeutic powders used to treat the king, and may actively have contributed to his illness. And while George III was incapable of ruling, his son, George, Prince of Wales, stepped in, ruling as regent with the consent of Parliament. The prince had a difficult relationship with his father. George III had refused to give his son any royal duties or responsibilities, and as a result, the bored and frustrated prince turned to pleasure. And he was criticised for his dissolute lifestyle, which involved drinking wine, seducing women as his 2 main activities. He had a large circle of friends and was highly charismatic. On meeting him, one politician described being charmed beyond measure by his elegance and gentlemanliness. And Thomas Lawrence certainly captures George's charisma in this dashing, although unfinished 1814 portrait, which was an early acquisition for the gallery. And that in terms of portraiture, that the Georgian period is the moment where the sort of English artists as an art form really hit their stride. This is the kind of centre of portraits in our collection and in terms of sort of European recognition of the art form. And Lawrence was one of the most successful portrait painters in 19th century England, and George IV was a great patron of the artist. And it's easy to see why when we consider that images of portraits like these created of a glamorous, fashionable and handsome prince. But by the time these portraits were made, the reality was somewhat different, as indicated by the ruthless caricatures of the prince, which were widely circulated, being available for the public to purchase relatively cheaply. So the most famous caricaturist of the late 18th century was Gilray, and he produced numerous biting satires featuring the prince. And one of the best known is this, A Voluntary Under the Horrors of Digestion, which emphasises George's unruly appetite and thoroughly undermines Lawrence's glamorous vision. So we have here his waistcoat held together by a single button, the remains of a meal with port and brandy decanters, empty wine bottles underneath it, a chamber pot of unpaid bills from the butcher, baker and doctor, jelly glasses and pot for the piles, and drops for stinking breath, and a parody coat of arms. And it seems likely that Gilray's depiction perhaps had a slight air of accuracy, given that his typical breakfast consisted of 2 pigeons and 3 beefsteaks, 3 parts of a bottle of Moselle wine, a glass of champagne, 2 glasses of port, and a glass of brandy. And satires like this flourished in Britain throughout the late 18th and early 19th centuries, becoming an important part of popular culture. And this is emphasised by the thousands of satirical images of the royal family now in the collections of the National Portrait Gallery. And the satirists' humorous, critical, and often cruel depictions of royal figures would have been unacceptable in other European cultures at the time. But by this point, Britain, as a constitutional monarchy with liberal censorship laws, meant that royals were as much a target as anyone else. And because of this, some historians have credited royal satires, like Gilray's image of George, with providing an outlet, which meant that at a time when other countries were undergoing bloody revolutions and which toppled monarchies, Britain remained relatively stable. That George finally came to the throne in his own right in 1820, reigning for 10 years. But his dissolute lifestyle meant he remained a thoroughly unpopular figure with the public. His younger brother, William IV, who reigned from 1830 until 1847, fared little better. And he was the last of the Hanoverian kings. And on his death, the throne passed to his 18-year-old niece, who would reign as Queen Victoria. At As a young female monarch, Victoria was considered the perfect antidote to the excesses of the Georgians, and her accession to the throne was greeted with a sense of hope and optimism. And it's summed up in George Hayter's official coronation portrait, in which the light settles on the new Queen's face as she appears to gaze towards a bright vision of the future. At the same time, this portrait is grounded in the past, with the state robes and crown that Victoria wears and the canopy and sceptre as symbols of royal authority, employed in coronation portraits since the 16th century. So this youthful monarch is backed by centuries of tradition. And this was a particularly important image in that numerous copies were commissioned to be given as gifts by the Queen and sent to British embassies abroad. Thus, at the outset of her reign, for many of Victoria's subjects across Britain's global empire, this was the defining image of their monarch. And like Elizabeth I before her, when Victoria came to the throne, she was expected to marry. But, like Elizabeth, Victoria found that as a queen, she relished her newfound autonomy and sought to avoid finding a husband. But all this changed in 1839 with a visit from her cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, a principality in present-day Germany. And in her diaries, Victoria wrote that Albert's beauty is most striking, and he is so amiable and unaffected. In short, very fascinating looking. As queen, Victoria could not be proposed to, so she asked Albert to marry her, and the pair wed in 1840. Over the next 17 years, Victoria and Albert had 9 children, and through their portraits, the royal family were presented to the public as an ideal vision of middle-class, morally respectable domesticity. And a range of relatively cheap formats brought royal portraits to a wide audience, fueling a desire amongst the public for images which seemed to provide a glimpse of everyday life behind closed doors. And this is one example of the type of image that was available for public consumption at the beginning of Victoria's reign. It shows Victoria and Albert surrounded by their 4 eldest children, with Albert playing horse. Originally, a set of doors was attached to the image, which could be opened to give the viewer a sense of an intimate glimpse into royal family life. And images like this were very popular, but mostly imaginary. With the advent of photography, however, the public were afforded seemingly accurate and truthful behind-the-scenes images of royalty. Victoria was captivated by the newly discovered process of photography and declared herself to be very much interested in it. She and Albert would go on to become important patrons of photography, and their enthusiasm helped to raise public interest in the new medium. In particular, Victoria was astutely aware that photography could prove instrumental in fashioning the public perception of her monarchy. In 1860, she gave permission for portraits of herself, Albert and their children by John Mayall to be released on sale to the public. And here we have 2 of Mayall's images of Victoria and Albert and the royal family from this period. And the appetite for these photographs proved insatiable, and hundreds of thousands of copies are reported to have been sold as carte de visite. The carte de visite is a small, cheap portrait photograph mounted on card, and they were collectible items for the upper and middle classes that could be exchanged between friends and assembled into albums. And Victoria herself enjoyed this form of popular entertainment. In her reminiscences, she recollects the joyful evening spent with Albert looking at photographs and carefully arranging the images into albums. Prince Albert died of typhoid fever in 1861, and Victoria went into a prolonged period of mourning, during which she withdrew almost completely from public life for the next 10 years and wore mourning dress for the rest of her life. Taken a year after Albert's death, William Bambridge's photograph shows Victoria and other members of the royal family grouped mournfully around Albert's bust. The Queen is wearing the black mourning dress and white veil, which would render her instantly recognisable to subsequent generations. And although Victoria resumed her public duties in 1871, she continued to mourn Albert until her own death in 1901. And this moving image of the Queen on her deathbed, again from the gallery's photographs collection, shows that she slept with an image of Albert above her own bed until the very end. And it's a testament to her devotion to her husband, but also to the important role that portraiture played in their relationship. Having produced a host of children, including 4 sons, Victoria seemed to have ensured the future stability of the monarchy, which had so often been threatened by the lack of an heir. And indeed, this seemed to be the case until the 1930s, when the royal family was rocked to its core by a crisis caused not by a lack of an heir, but the wrong sort of an heir. That Edward, Prince of Wales, was the son of George V and Queen Mary, and the great-grandson of Queen Victoria. He was charming, good-looking, popular with the public at every inch the Playboy prince. And here I'm showing you a magazine cover from the First World War, during which Edward served in the Grenadier Guards, and a popular postcard from the 1920s when he was the leader of London fashionable society. And both of these are testament to his sort of dapper charm, which no doubt encouraged him as he engaged in a number of affairs with wealthy married women throughout the 1920s. But early in 1931, while staying at the country house of his mistress, Lady Furness, Edward met the American businessman Ernest Simpson and his wife Wallis. Wallis was petite and vivacious, with the mesmerizing violet blue eyes captured in this incredibly striking portrait. And by 1934, she had begun an affair with the prince. It was not unusual for royal princes to have mistresses, but Edward saw Wallis as his life's companion and became determined to marry her. That when Edward inherited the throne in 1936, his desire to marry Wallis Simpson sparked a constitutional crisis. And in the face of united opposition by the royal family, the government, and the Church of England, on the grounds that a twice-divorced woman would be an unsuitable queen, Edward formally gave up the throne on 10th of December 1936. He made an historic radio broadcast the following day, in which he stated that he found it impossible to discharge his duties as king without the help and support of the woman I love. This photograph was taken on their wedding day in 1937. No members of Edward's family attended. After Edward's abdication, the throne passed to his brother, George VI, and George's quiet domesticity was seen as a welcome antidote to his brother's Playboy antics. His two daughters, Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret, were the focus of much popular attention, and their images circulated in photographs and postcards. These included this image of Elizabeth as a baby from her very first photo shoot, which you can see in the exhibition. And informal images of family life continued to give the public the impression that the royal family were just like them, increasing the popularity of George and his young family. This was further enhanced during the Second World War, when the royals were lauded for staying in London during the Blitz, even after Buckingham Palace was damaged by enemy action. And this famous photograph, taken on Victory in Europe Day, shows George VI with his wife, Queen Elizabeth, and the two princesses, with Britain's wartime Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. They are standing on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, waving at jubilant crowds, in what has become one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. That later, the princesses were permitted to leave the palace and secretly join the public celebrations. That George VI died relatively young of lung cancer in 1952, and the Princess Elizabeth inherited the throne as Queen Elizabeth II. She has now reigned for 66 years and is Britain's longest-serving monarch. Given her fame, her long reign, and the mass production of images in the 20th century, it's not surprising that Queen Elizabeth II is probably the most portrayed person in history. The National Portrait Gallery, which holds only a small selection of her portraits, has 986 images of the Queen in its collections. And her portraiture tells the story of her life and reign, but also of changing attitudes to the monarchy and developments in the visual arts across its long span. That when Elizabeth acceded to the throne in 1952, Dorothy Wilding, a favourite photographer of the royal family, was commissioned to produce a series of portraits to commemorate the event. And the National Portrait Gallery is incredibly fortunate in that it holds Wilding's entire surviving archive, which was presented by her sister Susan Morton in 1976. And we have an extensive selection of the accession photographs, two of which are included in Tudors to Windsors. And the examples selected for the exhibition typify the glamorous film star aesthetic associated with portraits of Elizabeth from early in her reign. And these images were particularly significant as they were displayed in British embassies and other government buildings around the world, as well as being used on stamps. And in fact, the postage stamps from early in the reign are known as Wildings, after the photographer, indicating just how well known and widely disseminated these images of the Queen became. And Wilding's representations of the Queen in the guise of a glamorous movie star contrast with images like those of Victoria and her family that purported to give a behind-the-scenes glimpse of the royal domesticity. So on the left, you can see one of Lord Snowdon's images of the Queen and her husband, Prince Philip, with their two eldest children. Snowdon succeeds in creating an image that seems to capture an intimate moment, with the royals all unaware, although the photographs were carefully staged in the grounds of Buckingham Palace. On the right is a photograph taken on the Royal Yacht Britannia by the Queen's cousin, Lord Lichfield, and it seems to capture her famed sense of humour, which is rarely on display in public. And the trend for access behind palace doors culminated in a 1969 BBC documentary called Royal Family. Film cameras were allowed unprecedented access to Elizabeth and her family, documenting their everyday lives for over a year. The photograph in the centre here, showing the decoration of the royal Christmas tree, was taken during filming. And the result was a behind-the-scenes documentary which riveted the British public. It was watched by 70% of the population, who were treated to the royals chatting at breakfast, taking a holiday at Sandringham and celebrating Christmas. However, the Queen reportedly regretted allowing the film to be made, and it hasn't been broadcast since 1969. In a reaction against both the everyday images of royalty and the movie star glamour that has defined Elizabeth's early portraits, Pietro Annigoni's famous 1969 portrait of Elizabeth places a new emphasis on majesty and the fulfillment of the Queen's official role. It was commissioned especially for the National Portrait Gallery, and the Queen expressed a preference to be painted by Annigoni. And the resulting image, which presents the Queen in a stark and solitary environment, generated much press and public attention. The artist explained that he did not want to paint her as a film star. I saw her as a monarch, alone in the problems of her responsibility. By contrast, the American artist Andy Warhol produced one of the most famous images of Elizabeth II as part of his Reigning Queen series in 1985. Like Annigoni, he rejects the idea of the Queen as just like us, which the domestic imagery promotes, but instead presents her in vibrantly coloured silkscreen and endlessly multiplied. He turns her into an icon of majesty. And this vision of the Queen, whilst highly memorable, is reminiscent of advertising images, as well as portraits of Elizabeth I in their focus on surface and recognisability rather than any hint of individuality. It's impossible for the viewer to access any sense of the person behind the mask. By the time Warhol created this portrait, the royals had become an established element of British celebrity culture, and the Queen's children in particular were followed by photographers and journalists, and their every move reported in the press. By 1980, when this portrait was painted, the Queen's eldest son, Charles, had gained a reputation as a playboy prince and found himself under pressure to make a suitable marriage. And in the same year, he began a relationship with Lady Diana Spencer, the beautiful 18-year-old daughter of John Earl Spencer and Frances Shan Kidd. Charles and Diana married in 1981, and the portrait of Diana was commissioned from Brian Organ as a companion piece to Charles's portrait to mark their engagement. The portraits are unusual in their formality, and that both sitters are without any royal regalia. The only clue to Charles's status is the Union Jack flag in the background. And the portrait of Diana was considered remarkable at the time because it represented a female member of the royal family wearing trousers. And this is today one of the most celebrated and popular of the National Portrait Gallery's royal portraits. Equally celebrated is this 1997 portrait of Diana by Mario Testino. After a separation, Charles and Diana had divorced in 1996, and this image shows Diana as an independent woman emerging from a difficult period. By this stage, she was an international celebrity in her own right, and was followed by paparazzi photographers wherever she went. Diana was famed for her charitable endeavours, and at the time this photograph was taken, she had also recently started a new relationship. The photos were commissioned for Vanity Fair magazine in connection with Diana's decision to auction many of her most famous gowns for charity, and they aimed to show her in a new light, away from the ceremony and formality that had dominated her life as a royal. This image appeared on the magazine's cover in July 1997, with the headline Diana Reborn. The image subsequently took on the tragic poignancy when Diana was killed in a car crash in Paris that August. This was her last official photo shoot. Today, a new generation of royals have become international celebrities and ambassadors for Britain around the globe. Charles and Diana's two sons, William and Harry, are seen here in their first official portrait, commissioned for the Portrait Gallery. At the time, both were serving in the household cavalry, and they are shown in their regimental dress uniform. The artist intentionally placed Prince Harry below his elder brother, and her notes indicate that this informal pose was challenging due to his difficulty bending his legs in his stiff dress trousers. That in 2012, Prince William married Catherine Middleton at Westminster Abbey. This portrait was commissioned from the artist Paul Emsley to mark the beginning of her public life as the Duchess of Cambridge and her role as the National Portrait Gallery's patron. Unusually in royal portraiture, it presents an intimate, closely cropped image of the sitter's face, with a direct gaze to engage the viewer. And since their marriage, the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge have had 3 children. Earlier this year, Prince Harry married the American actress Meghan Markle in a televised ceremony which was watched by over 50 million people in the UK and US alone. But for all the popular appeal and glamour of the new generation of royals, it is Queen Elizabeth II who continues to inspire today's leading artists to create the most original and insightful images of contemporary royalty. In 2007, Annie Leibovitz became the first American artist to make official portraits of the Queen. Setting her photographs in the White Drawing Room at Buckingham Palace, the artist has produced a clever and highly constructed image designed to project a picture of regal majesty while reflecting the Queen's determined and strong character. Also included in Tudors to Windsors is this 2012 portrait of Elizabeth by Chris Levine. The artist used a lenticular lens, combining multiple still images to create an illusion of depth and movement. Each exposure required at least 8 seconds, and resting between shots, the Queen closed her eyes just as this image was taken. Caught between her public persona and private self, the resulting portrait is one of the most haunting and ethereal images of the most portrayed person in British history. At once immediate and remote, it provides a rare insight into the vulnerability of a ruler. And the combination of royal power and psychological insight is the hallmark of the most successful royal portraits that I've discussed today. Over the centuries, images of royals, from monumental full-length oil paintings to tiny collectible carte de visite photographs, have both fed and fueled demand for royal portraits and made them accessible to ever wider audiences. Drawing on tradition whilst also inspiring artistic innovation, these images express the individual personalities of Britain's kings and queens. And they seem to provide viewers with personal encounters with these famous historic figures. Sometimes they convince us that the royals are just like us, but at others they remind us of the power distance and even loneliness associated with monarchy. And it's this paradoxical combination of intimacy and unknowability, tradition and innovation, that draws both artists and audiences to royal images again and again, and that makes the royal portraits in the collections of the National Portrait Gallery so compelling.
Thank you, Charlotte, for a magnificent lecture. Do go up and enjoy the exhibition for as long as it's on today. We won't take any questions right now because Charlotte has to go to the airport to fly back to London. But thank you again for a superb lecture.